The wind on Vere did not just blow. It screamed a high-pitched tearing sound that felt like it was trying to separate the soul from the bone. It was the Black Winter, a season that lasted for 3 standard years, where the magnetic dust storms choked out the sun and turned the world into a graveyard of gray ice and static. Mason Hart adjusted the thermal seal on his collar, wincing as the haptic feedback in his gloves buzzed a low warning. His suit was running on 12% power, just enough to keep his blood from turning into slush, but not enough to stop the shivering that had settled deep in his marrow. He trudged forward, his magnetic boots locking and unlocking with the metallic terrain, with a rhythmic thud-clack thud-clack that was the only orderly thing in this chaotic expanse. He was a salvage mechanic, a man who fixed things that were broken, provided they did not talk back. He had spent the last 10 years jumping from one backwater rock to another, following a strict code: fix the engine, take the credits, and never look the client in the eye. Eye contact led to conversations. Conversations led to empathy. And empathy was a liability he could not afford. Mason paused, sheltering behind a jagged spire of obsidian rock, to check his supplies. He tapped the side of his pack. It felt light. Too light. He rummaged through the side pocket and pulled out his inventory. 2, he muttered, his voice raspy from the dry, recycled air of his helmet. Just 2 left. He held up the squeeze packets of Nutri-Gel. They were standard-issue survival rations, a dense, flavorless white paste that contained every vitamin a human body needed to not die and absolutely zero joy. The packaging claimed it was vanilla-flavored. Mason called it milk, mostly because calling it reprocessed algae sludge made it harder to swallow. 1 for dinner, he said to the empty storm. 1 for breakfast. And if I don't find the settlement by noon tomorrow, I guess I start eating my boots. He was about to stow them away when his helmet's sensor array pinged. It was a soft, frantic chime, indicating a thermal anomaly. Mason narrowed his eyes, scanning the readout projected on his visor. To his left, about 50 yards through the blinding curtain of gray dust, there was a heat signature. It was steady, rhythmic, and warm. Probably a vent, he reasoned, though he turned his body toward it. Geothermal pocket. Maybe I can recharge the suit. He pushed off the rock, fighting the gale that tried to knock him flat. As he moved closer, the wind seemed to change. The metallic tang of ozone and rust that usually filled the air was cut by something else. It was sharp, sweet, and confusingly clean. It smelled like frost mint. Mason frowned. Nothing organic grew in the Black Winter. He drew his multi-tool from his belt. It was a heavy, wrench-like device that could weld steel or crack a skull if swung hard enough and approach the source. It was a cave mouth half buried in a drift of magnetic snow. The heat radiating from it was not the sulfurous burn of a thermal vent. It was gentle, humid. He stepped inside, the sudden silence of the cave rushing into his ears as the wind died down. The interior was not dark. The walls were lined with a bioluminescent moss that pulsed with a soft teal light. The rhythm of the light was steady, beating like a slow, giant heart. It illuminated the cavern in a dream-like haze, revealing that Mason was not alone. In the center of the cave, nestled in a depression lined with what looked like woven silk and dried insulating foam, were 3 small bundles. Mason lowered his multi-tool, his curiosity overriding his caution. He stepped closer. They were alive. They were small, curled into tight balls, shivering violently. At first glance, they looked like feline cubs, but the anatomy was wrong. Their ears were too long, tapering to elegant points that twitched with every pulse of the moss. Their fur was short and velvety, patterned with faint, swirling markings that seemed to shift even as he watched. "Easy now," Mason whispered, crouching down. "Where is your mother?" He reached out a gloved hand, intending to check for a pulse on the nearest one. A shadow detached itself from the ceiling. Mason did not hear her land. 1 second he was looking at the cubs. The next, a figure was standing between him and the nest moving with a speed that blurred the air. He scrambled back, raising the multi-tool, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was humanoid tall and lithe, clad in tattered remnants of a material that shimmered like liquid mercury. But it was her face that froze him. She was undeniably alien, with high, sharp cheekbones and skin the color of pale moonlight. Her ears were like the cubs flattened against her skull in aggression, and a long, furred tail lashed behind her, kicking up dust. But it was her eyes, silver reflective, like pools of wet metal that locked onto him. There was no pupils, just an endless, terrified chrome. She did not hiss. She did not roar. She spoke, her voice trembling with a desperate melodic cadence, her English perfect, but accented with a strange purring undertone. "My cubs are starving!" she cried out, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She looked at the white packets in Mason's other hand, her silver eyes widening. "Just give them milk and I will be your mate forever." Mason blinked. The adrenaline was still pumping through his system, making his thoughts race. But the sheer absurdity of the statement made his brain stutter. He looked at the alien woman, who looked ready to kill him or beg him, and then looked down at the Nutrigel in his hand. He had been alone in a frozen hellscape for 3 weeks. He was hungry, cold, and running on 12% power. And now, an alien princess, because she looked like nothing less than royalty even in rags, was proposing a life bond over a packet of vanilla paste. The reflex to deflect, to use humor as a shield against the surreal, kicked in before he could stop it. "Lady," Mason said, his voice dry, "I don't even know your last name yet, and we are already at the forever part." The woman did not blink. She did not smile. The joke hit her like a stone hitting water. It sank without a trace. Her expression intensified, a mix of confusion and ferocious intent. "Vow," she said, the word heavy. "Not courtship. Life. Death. Bond." She took a step forward, and Mason saw the tremble in her legs. She was exhausted. She was terrifying, yes, but she was running on fumes. "Give them," she whispered, pointing to the gel. "Please, they fade." Mason looked past her at the cubs. Now that he looked closer, he saw it. Their fur was dull. The faint bioluminescence that should have been radiating from their skin was flickering like a dying bulb. One of them, the smallest, let out a sound, a high, thin mewl that sounded painfully like a human infant crying in its sleep. Mason felt a sharp tug in his chest, an old scar tearing open. Don't, he told himself. Don't look at the kid. Look at the problem. Fix the machine, ignore the operator. But the sound came again, weaker this time. Before Mason could decide, a rustle from the shadows behind the moss patch made him spin around, bringing the multi-tool up again. "If you are going to shoot him, do it quickly," a new voice said. "Though I doubt that wrench will do much against his kinetic shielding if he has it active." A human woman stepped out from the darkness. She was wrapped in layers of scavenged thermal blankets, her face smeared with grease to prevent frostbite. She wore thick, round spectacles that reflected the teal light of the cave. She looked like a pile of laundry that had gained sentience and a cynical attitude. "Who are you?" Mason asked, backing up, so he could keep both the alien and the new woman in his field of view. "Dr. Aravale," the woman said, adjusting her glasses. "Biologist. Ex-University of Terra, currently resident of this hole in the ground. I live on the cave algae." She gestured to the glowing moss. "It tastes like feet, but it keeps the heart beating." She looked at the alien woman. "Calixa, he is not one of them. Look at his boots. Standard issue salvage. He is a mechanic, not a hunter." The alien woman, Calixa, did not take her eyes off Mason's hand. "He has milk." "It is Nutrigel," Mason corrected, lowering his tool slightly. "And that is all I have." "They are dying," Calixa said, her voice cracking. "The black winter, the stars are hidden. They cannot feed." Dr. Aravale sighed, moving closer to the cubs. Illuri physiology, she explained to Mason, as if she were giving a lecture in a climate-controlled hall rather than a freezing cave. The adults can survive on solid matter for a while, though it weakens them. But the cubs, they are phototrophic hybrids. They need specific radiation from starlight to catalyze their metabolism. Without it, or a high-density caloric substitute, their organs shut down. They are starving to death in the dark. Mason looked at the gel packets. 2 packets, maybe 600 calories each. Enough to keep him walking for another 24 hours. Or enough to keep 3 alien kittens alive for how long he looked at Calixa. She had stopped demanding. She was just watching him, her chest heaving, her silver eyes wet. She looked less like a monster now and more like a mother standing over a hospital bed. Mason cursed under his breath. He hated himself for what he was about to do. "Fine," he grunted. He walked past Calixa, who flinched but stood her ground. He knelt beside the nest. Up close, the cubs were even smaller. He tore the top off the first packet. The smell of artificial vanilla wafted up sickly sweet. "How do I do this?" Mason asked. Slowly, Calixa said, dropping to her knees beside him. Her movement was fluid, silent. "On your finger. Let them scent it." Mason squeezed a dollop of the white paste onto his gloved index finger. He held it out to the nearest cub, a male with dark gray fur. The cub stirred. Its nose twitched. Then, with a sudden desperate burst of energy, it latched onto Mason's finger, sucking greedily. The sensation through the glove was faint, but Mason could feel the vibration of the tiny creature's throat. "Easy, little guy," Mason murmured. As the cub swallowed the gel, a miracle happened. The faint, swirling patterns on its fur began to ignite. A soft blue light bloomed beneath the skin, spreading outward from its stomach like ink in water. The cub's shivering slowed. Mason squeezed more gel, sharing it between the 3 of them. The second one, a female with lighter fur, and the third, a sturdy-looking male, fought over the paste. Mason watched the light return to them. It was mesmerizing. They glowed like wet leaves under a full moon, bioluminescent and beautiful. For a second, the cave vanished. Mason was back on the colony ship Icarus. He was holding a hand that was too small, too cold. He was telling a little girl that the escape pod was coming, that the air would last. He was lying. He had failed then. He had fixed the door mechanism 1 minute too late. "You have kind hands." Calixa's voice broke his trance. Mason jerked his hand back, standing up abruptly. He wiped the remaining gel on his thigh. The packets were empty. His dinner and breakfast were gone. "I have efficient hands," Mason corrected his voice harder than he intended. "Don't read into it." Calixa looked at him, her head tilted. She reached out and touched the head of the cub that had eaten first. "You saved them. The vow stands." "Look, lady." "Calixa," she interrupted. "My name is Princess Calixa of the High Spire, Illuri." "Okay, Princess," Mason said. "I am Mason, and the vow is void. I gave them a snack. I didn't sign a marriage contract." "It is not marriage," Dr. Era Vale interjected, from where she was checking a handheld scanner near the cave entrance. "In Illuri culture, a mate is not necessarily a romantic partner in the human sense. It is a biological imperative, a survival pact. You provided sustenance when they were fading. You are now chemically significant to them. And to her." "Great," Mason muttered. "I am chemically significant. Can I put that on a resume?" "You can put it on your tombstone if you do not lower your voice," Era said sharply. She turned her face, pale beneath the grease. "I am picking up seismic tremors, micro-vibrations in the ice." Calixa stiffened. Her ears swiveled toward the cave mouth. "Scar Inquisitors." The name hung in the air, heavy and cold. Mason had heard rumors of the Scar Inquisitors in the bars of the orbital stations. They were a fanatic sect, hunters who believed in the purity of genetic lines. They didn't just kill. They erased. "How close?" Mason asked the soldier in him, taking over the mechanic. "Close," Calixa hissed. Her fur stood on end. "They move on the snow. They do not sink." Mason walked to the entrance, peering out. The storm was still raging, but the air felt different. It was too quiet. The screaming wind had dropped to a low, menacing hum. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath before the pounce. "Why are they hunting you?" Mason asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Calixa scooped the 3 cubs up. They were drowsy now, full of gel and glowing softly. She placed them into a sling made of the silken material she wore. "Because they are not pure," Calixa said, looking down at the cubs. "Because I chose a father who was not chosen for me. The council calls them abominations. I call them my children." She looked at Mason. "We must reach the Sky Needle." Mason looked at the map in his head. "The crystal spire on the north ridge that is 10 miles uphill. In a magnetic storm. With hunters on our tail. That is suicide." "It is the only way," Era said. She was packing her few belongings, a datapad, a few jars of algae samples, into a battered satchel. "The Sky Needle is a geocrystalline amplifier. There is a phenomenon predicted for dawn. A sky break. A momentary gap in the dust layer. If we can get the cubs to the spire when the light hits, the crystal will amplify the stellar radiation. It will be enough to fully charge their systems. They will be able to survive the rest of the winter." "And if we miss it?" Mason asked. "Then they starve," Calixa said simply. "And the Inquisitors mount their heads on pikes." Mason looked at the cubs. They were asleep now, 3 glowing embers in the sling against their mother's chest. He had a choice. He could walk away. He could tell them good luck, head south, and hope his suit power lasted until he found a settlement. That was the smart play. That was the Mason Hart rulebook, survival first, principles second. But he looked at Calixa's eyes. There was no deception there. Just a terrifying, raw clarity. "I will be your mate forever." She meant she would die for him if he helped them. She meant she would kill for him. 10 miles, Mason said, checking his suit charge. 11%. "We need to move fast." "You will help?" Calixa asked, her voice softening. "I am going that way anyway," Mason lied. He wasn't. The settlement was south. The needle was north. "I'll get you to the base of the tower. Then I am gone. No vows, no bonding, no forever. Clear?" Calixa studied him. For a moment he thought she might smile, but she just nodded solemnly. "Clear, Mason Hart." "Let's go," Mason said. "Doctor, you coming?" "I am not staying here to be practiced on by Inquisitors," Era said, strapping her bag tight. "I know the lower paths. I can guide us through the ravine." They moved to the mouth of the cave. The cold hit them instantly, biting through Mason's suit. He activated his multi-tool, setting it to a low-frequency pulse mode that might confuse simple motion sensors. As they stepped out into the whiteout, Mason glanced back at the cave. The warmth was already fading. The smell of frost mint was being scoured away by the smell of ozone and impending violence. "Stay close!" Mason shouted over the wind. "And keep those cubs covered. If they glow, we are targets." Calixa pulled her cloak tight, over the sling hiding the light. She moved beside him, her steps light, almost dancing over the drifts where he had to trudge. They headed up the slope, into the teeth of the storm. Behind them, about 500 yards down the valley, the darkness seemed to thicken. Shapes detached themselves from the night. They were tall, encased in matte black armor that drank the little ambient light that existed. They did not walk. They slid their boots equipped with magnetic gliders that allowed them to skate over the snow without breaking the surface. There were 6 of them. They moved in perfect synchronization, silent, deadly and fast. Mason felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't need his sensors to know they were there. He could feel the weight of their attention. He gripped his multi-tool tighter, gritted his teeth, and pushed forward. "Just to the tower," he whispered to himself. "Just to the tower, then I bail. Do not get attached. Do not get attached." But as he walked, he found himself matching his pace to the alien woman beside him, his body angling to shield her from the wind. He was a liar, and he knew it. The race for the skybreak had begun. The silence on Virai was a lie. It felt empty, but beneath the howling wind, the magnetic fields hummed a low, nauseating frequency that vibrated in the teeth. Mason Hart adjusted the straps of his pack, his shoulders aching from the tension. He was walking into death, he knew that much. But the alternative was walking away, and for some reason, his feet refused to pivot south. He reached back and tapped the hard shell of his backpack. "Pip," Mason said, his voice cracking slightly in the dry air. "Wake up, I need eyes." There was a mechanical whir, followed by the sound of pressurized air hissing as a small panel on his pack slid open. A drone no larger than a dinner plate and shaped like a horseshoe crab floated up. Its single ocular sensor glowed a dull amber, spinning to adjust to the low light. "Systems initializing," the drone chirped. Its voice synthesizer was set to a default male tenor that Mason had never bothered to change, mostly because he enjoyed arguing with it. "Battery at 40%, hull integrity at 80%. Current chance of survival based on local atmospheric conditions and your heart rate low." "Good morning to you too," Mason grumbled. "Scan the ridge behind us. Thermal in motion." Pip buzzed, ascending 10 feet into the swirling gray dust. "Scanning. By the way, I was in sleep mode for 58 minutes. In that time, your biometrics indicate a spike in cortisol, adrenaline, and oxytocin. That is the bonding hormone." Pip hovered lower, drifting near Calixa, who was walking a few paces ahead with the cubs bundled against her chest. "You acquired a family in under 1 hour. That is a new record even for a catastrophic life decision." "It is not a family," Mason snapped, checking his wrist comp. "It is a cargo run. We are delivering the package to the Sky Needle, and then we are done." "If you say so," Pip said, sounding unconvinced. "Detecting thermal signatures 3 miles back. Multiple targets. Moving fast. They are not using standard propulsion." Mason stopped signaling for Calixa and Dr. Era Vale to halt. He turned, squinting into the gloom. He could not see them yet, but he could feel them. The Scar Inquisitors. "We need to keep moving," Calixa whispered. She looked exhausted. The silver sheen of her eyes had dulled to the color of tarnished pewter. "The cubs need fuel." Mason looked at the endless white expanse ahead. They had been walking for 2 hours since leaving the cave. The cubs were quiet, which was bad. Silence meant they were conserving energy they did not have. "Stop here," Mason ordered, pointing to a shallow overhang beneath a shelf of rock. 5 minutes. We need to stretch the rations." "You have no rations," Calixa said, her voice tightening with panic. "You said the packets were empty." "I am a mechanic," Mason said, dropping his pack. "I improvise. Doctor, give me the algae." Dr. Era Vale, who had been trudging along in a misery-induced silence, blinked behind her fogged spectacles. She rummaged in her satchel and produced a jar of dry green powder. "This is dehydrated spirulina concentrate. It is meant for cellular regeneration, not whatever you are planning." Mason took the jar. He pulled a collapsible metal cup from his belt and scooped up a handful of clean snow. He engaged the heating element in his multi-tool, pressing the glowing coil against the bottom of the cup. The snow hissed and melted into steaming water. He dumped a generous amount of the green powder into it, then took the empty Nutrigel packets he had saved. He slit them open, scraping the interior lining with a small knife to get every last smear of the vanilla paste. He stirred the mixture. It turned a sludgy swamp green color that smelled faintly of pond water and artificial sugar. "Dinner is served," Mason said, handing the cup to Calixa. The princess looked at the cup with a mixture of horror and fascination. She sniffed it, her nose wrinkling. "This is food." "It is calories," Mason said. "The algae has protein. The gel residue has sugar. It is not going to win any culinary awards, but it will keep their engines running." Calixa looked at him, then at the cup. She dipped a finger into the warm sludge and offered it to the cubs. The reaction was immediate. The cubs, sensing the heat and the nutrients, lapped it up. It was not the pure starlight they needed, but it was enough to stop the flickering of their bioluminescence. "It works," Calixa breathed, looking up at Mason. There was a shift in her expression, a fracturing of the regal mask she wore. "You understand mixtures." "I understand fuel lines," Mason corrected, looking away. He did not want her gratitude. Gratitude was sticky. It made it harder to leave. Pip update on the bogies. "They have closed the distance," Pip reported, hovering nervously above the overhang. 2 miles. Mason, their heat signatures are weird. They are barely registering above the ambient temperature of the ice. Their suits are heat sink equipped. Mason swore softly. "Stealth tech. They are not just hunters, they are assassins." He looked out at the path they had walked. The snow was deep, and their own footprints were distinct deep troughs in the powder. A blind man could track them. "We need a diversion," Mason said. He dug into his pack and pulled out a heavy rectangular object. It was a salvage battery from a crashed mining skiff he had stripped weeks ago. It was damaged, leaking ionizing radiation, but it still held a charge. "Doctor," Mason said, "how fast can you run?" "I am a biologist, not an athlete," Era replied, shivering. "But if the alternative is being dissected, I can move quite briskly." "Good. Take the cubs. Go up that ridge toward the scree field. The rocks will hide your tracks." "And you?" Calixa asked, stepping forward. She handed the empty cup back to him. "I am going to leave a breadcrumb," Mason said. He took the battery and buried it halfway in the snow, right in the center of their tracks. He set his multi-tool to overload mode and jammed it into the battery's terminal. A warning light blinked red. "This is going to vent heat like a flare in about 10 minutes, Mason explained. "It will create a massive thermal bloom. If their sensors are set to track body heat, this will look like a bonfire. It might buy us 20 minutes of confusion." "It is a primitive trick," Calixa observed, though her tone was not insulting. "Primitive works," Mason said. "Now move." They scrambled up the rocky incline, leaving the snow behind. The wind was picking up again, whipping ice crystals into their faces. Mason took the rear, his eyes scanning the white void below. 10 minutes later, as they crested the ridge, Pip chimed in. "Here they come." Mason dropped to his belly, peering over the edge. Through the haze, he saw them. There were 6 figures. They were tall, encased in armor that seemed to absorb the light around them. They carried long, slender rifles that looked more like harpoons. But it was their movement that made Mason's blood run cold. They did not trudge. They did not step. They glided. "Magnetic suspension," Mason whispered. "Their boots are repelling the metallic dust in the snow." The lead figure stopped. It was Arch Justicar Drake Morrow. Mason assumed from the ornate crest on his helmet. Morrow looked down at the snow. There were no footprints where the Inquisitors stood. They hovered an inch above the surface ghosts in the machine of the world. Morrow turned his head toward the buried battery. The heat bloom must have just registered. 2 of the Inquisitors broke formation, sliding toward the trap with unnatural speed. Boom. The battery did not explode with fire. It exploded with steam and superheated ozone. A cloud of white vapor erupted, blinding the sensors of the approaching hunters. "Go!" Mason hissed, pushing himself up. "Move, move!" They ran. Or rather, they stumbled rapidly across the loose stones of the ridge. The terrain was treacherous, a field of ankle-breaking rocks hidden under a thin layer of frost. Calixa stumbled, clutching the cubs tight. Mason grabbed her arm, hauling her upright. "I can help," she gasped. "The light weave." "You are drained," Mason said. "Save it." "No," she insisted. She stopped, turning back toward the cloud of steam below. She raised one hand. Her skin began to glow, not the soft blue of the cubs, but a sharp prismatic silver. She made a slashing motion in the air. For a second the air behind them shimmered. A duplicate image of the ridge appeared slightly offset from reality. It was like looking through a bad lens. The rocks seemed to shift to the path, disappearing into a false wall of ice. "It is an illusion," Calixa said, her hand dropping. She leaned heavily against Mason. "It will not stop them, but it will make them aim wrong." "Useful," Mason admitted. "Let's hope they have bad eyesight." They pressed on. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the deep, grinding ache of endurance. The sky needle was visible now, a jagged splinter of crystal, piercing the dark clouds miles ahead. It looked impossibly far. As they walked, the smallest cub, Kit, poked his head out of the sling on Calixa's chest. He looked at Mason with wide, unblinking eyes. He reached out a tiny clawed hand and grasped the loose strap of Mason's backpack. "Hey," Mason grumbled, trying to shake the strap loose. "Personal space, kid. Don't touch the equipment." The cub did not let go. Instead, it let out a soft purr of vibration that traveled up the strap and into Mason's shoulder. "He likes you," Calixa said softly. "He senses your protection." "He senses the heat from my suit battery," Mason countered. But he did not pull the strap away. In fact, as the wind howled louder, Mason found his hand drifting up unconsciously, adjusting the sling to tuck the cub's head back in, shielding it from the cold. Dr. Era Vale, walking beside them, watched this interaction with a critical eye. "You are terrible at being a mercenary, Mr. Hart," she observed. "I am doing the job," Mason said defensively. "If you leave them at the base of the tower," Era said, her voice cutting through the wind, "they will die. You know that. The tower requires activation. The scars will be on them before the skybreak hits. If you walk away, you are just killing them with extra steps." Mason stopped. He glared at the biologist. "I did not ask for a lecture on ethics, Doctor. I found them. I fed them. I am guiding them. That is more than anyone else on this godforsaken rock would do." "And it is not enough," Era said simply. "You know it. That is why you are angry." Mason opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. She was right. He felt the familiar weight in his chest, the ghost of the girl he hadn't saved on the Icarus. He remembered looking at the escape pod door, the red light, the silence. He had chosen to secure the engine room first. Logical, tactical, and fatal for the passengers in Section 4. "Why does the Council care so much?" Mason asked, turning to Calixa to distract himself from his own guilt. "They are just kids. Why hunt them down with a death squad?" Calixa looked at the ground. "The Alluri value purity. We are starborn. Our genetic code is tuned to the specific radiation of our home star. To mix with another species to create a hybrid is seen as a corruption, a static in the song." She looked up, her eyes fierce. "But my mate was kind. He was a traveler like you. He did not care about the song. He cared about me. The Council killed him before the cubs were born. Now they want to erase the mistake." Mason scoffed, a harsh sound in the cold air. "So your Council sends elite assassins to murder babies because they don't fit the sheet music. Your Council has way too much free time. On Earth, we just argue on the internet." Calixa blinked. "Internet, never mind," Mason said. "It is a different kind of torture." Pip's sensor alarm shrieked, cutting the conversation short. "Contact right flank, they flanked us." Mason spun around. Two Inquisitors had bypassed the ridge, using their magnetic gliders to scale the vertical rock face. They were 50 yards away, raising their rifles. "Down!" Mason roared. He shoved Calixa and Era behind a boulder, just as the air split with a crackling sound. A bolt of coherent plasma slammed into the rock where Calixa's head had been a second ago, sending shards of stone flying. "Return fire!" Pip yelled, though the drone had no weapons. Mason pulled his multi-tool, dialing it to the highest setting plasma cutter. It had a range of maybe 10 feet. Useless against snipers. "We can't fight them here," Mason yelled. He looked around. To their left was a fissure in the ice, a dark, jagged crack that ran down the side of the mountain. It was steep, terrifyingly deep, and their only option. "The crevice," Mason pointed. "That is a drop of 300 feet, Era screamed. "It is a slide," Mason corrected. "Probably. Maybe. Jump." The Inquisitors fired again. The ground around them exploded in steam. Mason didn't wait for a vote. He grabbed Era's arm with one hand and Calixa's with the other, and he threw himself into the void. They fell. For a heartbeat, there was only weightlessness and the rush of wind. Then they hit the slope. It was not a sheer drop, thank whatever gods were listening, but a steep, icy chute, angled at 45 degrees. They slid a tangle of limbs and gear. Mason tried to dig his heels in, but the ice was too hard. He spun around, seeing the world blur. He saw Calixa curling her body around the cubs, turning herself into a living shield. He saw Era screaming something that sounded like scientific equations regarding terminal velocity. They hit a bank of powdery snow at the bottom, tumbling over each other before coming to a stop in a heap. Silence returned. Mason lay on his back, staring up at the slit of gray sky far above. He did a mental inventory, arms attached, legs attached, suit integrity at 80%, dignity at 0. "Everyone alive?" he groaned. Era sat up, wiping snow from her glasses. "I believe I have bruised my everything." From the pile of snow next to him, a sound erupted. It was a rhythmic, chuffing noise. Mason propped himself up on one elbow, alarmed. Was she injured? Was she crying? Calixa burst out of the snow, her hair wild, her eyes wide, and she was laughing. It was a strange musical sound, like bells chiming underwater. She hugged the cubs who were squeaking in confusion and laughed until she gasped for air. "We flew," she managed to say. "We fell and we did not break." Mason stared at her. The terrifying alien princess, the feral mother, was sitting in a snowbank, giggling like a schoolgirl. "You are in shock," Mason noted. "I am alive," Calixa corrected her laughter, fading into a wide, breathless smile. She looked at Mason. "You threw us off a mountain." "I tactically repositioned us," Mason said, sitting up and brushing snow off his armor. "There is a difference." "Human tactics are very chaotic," Calixa said, wiping a tear from her silver cheek. "It keeps the enemy guessing," Mason said. "And me." They were in a deep canyon, now the walls rising high on both sides. The wind was blocked here, making it strangely quiet. "This is the Echo Ravine," Era said, looking around nervously. Her voice seemed to double, layering over itself. Ravine, great," Mason said. "I hate places with names like that. It usually implies ghosts or unstable geology." "It is a magnetic anomaly," Era explained. "The acoustic properties here are distorted by the mineral deposits. Sound waves get trapped, amplified, and delayed. Be careful what you say. The ravine remembers." They stood up, checking their gear. The cubs were shaken, but unharmed. "Mason," Calixa said, her voice echoing slightly. Mason. "Yeah. Back there before the jump. You said you usually argue on the internet." She paused. "What is a human mate like if not a vow?" Mason checked his multi-tool, avoiding her eyes. "It is complicated. Usually it involves paperwork. A contract called a marriage license. Then you move in together. You argue about whose turn it is to wash the dishes. You argue about money. You argue about the temperature in the room. And then you pay taxes together until one of you dies. Calixa frowned. That sounds inefficient. Where is the bond? The blood sink. We don't do blood sinks, Mason said. We just try to tolerate each other. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you end up alone on a salvage ship talking to a drone. I detect high levels of cynicism, Pip chimed in. Cynicism, quiet, Pip, Mason said. I think, Calixa said thoughtfully, that humans make simple things very hard. To be a mate is to say, I will not let you fall. You did that today. No paperwork needed. Mason looked at her. In the dim light of the ravine, she looked less alien and more real. Her definition was simple, brutal, and annoyingly accurate. We are not mates, Calixa, Mason said, though his voice lacked the heat it had earlier. I am just the transport. If you say so, Calixa said, a hint of amusement returning to her voice. Say so, we need to move, Era interrupted. The shortcut to the needle is through here, but the acoustic delay creates a disorientation effect. If we stay too long, we start hearing things that aren't there, memories. Mason looked down the long, twisting throat of the ravine. The shadows seemed to stretch and curl. He could already hear a faint whispering sound, like a radio left on static in another room. Lead the way, Doctor, Mason said. They began to walk. The walls of the ravine loomed over them, pressing in. Above them, the sky was still a relentless gray. Dawn was hours away. Behind them, far up on the ridge, the Scar Inquisitors stood at the edge of the fissure. Morrow looked down into the dark. He did not need to see them to know they survived. He raised his hand, signaling his squad. They did not jump. They activated grappling lines descending the ice wall with the silent, terrifying grace of spiders. The sound of their descent was swallowed by the wind, but the rhythm was there. A silent beat. Closer, closer. Mason felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He gripped his multi-tool, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. But as he looked at the three small, glowing shapes bobbing in the sling ahead of him, he realized that for the first time in 10 years, he was terrified of losing something he didn't even own. Don't get attached, he whispered to the echoing walls. Attached, the ravine whispered back, mocking him. The geology of Echo Ravine was not natural. It was a wound in the planet's crust, a jagged tear, where the magnetic field of Veri grew so dense that it warped the air itself. The walls were composed of magnetite and obsidian rising vertically into the swirling darkness, like the walls of a cathedral built by madmen. Mason Hart hated it immediately. It was not the cold that bothered him, though the temperature gauge on his suit was flashing, a warning that the ambient temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. It was the sound, or rather the delay of the sound. When his boot crunched on the frozen gravel, the noise did not reach his ears instantly. It lingered trapped in the magnetic distortion, and bounced back 3 seconds later, louder and deeper than the original sound. Crunch. 3 seconds of silence. Crunch. It was disorienting. It messed with his equilibrium. But Dr. Aravale had warned them it would do more than just repeat footsteps. The ravine was psychoacoustic. The peculiar vibration of the crystals in the walls interacted with the electrical impulses of the brain. It didn't just echo sound. It echoed intent. It pulled the subvocalizations, the half-formed thoughts, the lies one told oneself, and broadcast them back as a distorted whisper. Mason kept his head down, focusing on the rhythmic flash of Calixa's heels ahead of him. She was carrying the sling with the 3 cubs, her posture rigid. Just keep moving, Mason muttered to himself. Don't think. Just walk. Don't think, coward, just run. The whisper came from the wall to his left. It sounded like him, but younger. It sounded like the Mason from 10 years ago. Mason stiffened his hand, going to the multi-tool at his belt. I said shut up. Shut up, fix the machine, let them die, fix the machine, the echo was digging. It was pulling up the memory of the Icarus. Mason squeezed his eyes shut for a brief second as he walked. He could see the red emergency light spinning. He could see the blast door. He had been the lead mechanic. The protocol stated that in the event of a hull breach, the structural integrity of the engine core was the priority. If the core went, everyone died. If the section sealed, only a few died. He had sealed the section. He had fixed the locking mechanism. He had done his job perfectly. And because he had done his job, a woman he had loved, not a mate, not a wife, but someone who mattered, had suffocated on the other side of 3 inches of steel. "You survived the wall," whispered its voice, dripping with sarcasm. Efficient hands. Cold hands. "It is just rocks," Mason said aloud, his voice harsh. "It is just magnetic interference." Ahead of him, Calixa stumbled. She caught herself on a jagged outcrop of rock. She was not looking at Mason. She was staring into the dark crevice of the ravine floor. "No," she whispered. "Monster," the ravine hissed back at her. "Beasts feral." Calixa flinched, as if she had been struck. She pulled the sling tighter against her chest. "They are beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. "They are my children. They will be hunted, always hunted. You cursed them, selfish mother." The echo was twisting her deepest insecurity. She did not fear death. She was a warrior of the high spire. She had faced plasma fire and frost without blinking. But she feared that her love was a poison. She feared that by bringing these hybrids into a universe that demanded purity, she had doomed them to a life of pain. Mason walked up beside her. He grabbed her elbow, his grip firm. "Don't listen to it," he said. His voice echoed back, "Don't listen, liar." "It is just noise, princess," Mason said, ignoring his own ghost. "It is just feedback loops. It doesn't know anything." "It sounds like my father," Calixa said, her silver eyes wide and unseeing. "He told me I was broken, that I loved wrong." "Your father sounds like a charming guy," Mason said. "But he is not here. We are." Pip the drone floated between them. The machine seemed immune to the psychological torture, likely because it had no subconscious to exploit. It whirred softly at Sensor Eye, scanning the path ahead. "The acoustic variance is fascinating," Pip chirped. "But I detect a physiological spike in both of you. Heart rates are elevated. Cortisol levels are critical. You are both reacting to atmospheric vibrations." "Not now, Pip," Mason growled. "Analysis," Pip continued, oblivious to the mood. "Mason, your stress markers correlate with avoidance behavior. You typically initiate an escape protocol when emotional engagement exceeds safe parameters. The echo is merely verbalizing your standard operating procedure you run when things begin to matter." Mason stopped dead. The drone's mechanical voice didn't echo. It just hung there, brutal and precise. "I don't run," Mason said through gritted teeth. "I make tactical withdrawals." "Run, always running," the ravine mocked. Mason raised his hand to swat the drone, then stopped. He lowered his hand. He didn't hit the machine. He just stared at the path ahead, his jaw set so hard it ached. "Let's move," was all he said. They trudged deeper. The walls grew higher, narrowing until the sky was just a thin ribbon of gray smoke far above. Then the silence broke. It was not a whisper this time. It was a voice, amplified by technology, booming down from the canyon rim, like the voice of an angry god. "Calixa!" The name slammed into the walls, bouncing back and forth, layering over itself, until it sounded like a choir of judgment. "Calixa, Calixa." "Calixa," Dr. Era Vale gasped, pressing herself against the rock face. Morrow, high above, standing on the edge of the ravine, where the wind whipped his black cloak, stood Arch-Justicar Drake Morrow. He was using a directional sonic emitter, turning the acoustic properties of the ravine into a weapon. "There is no escape, Princess," Morrow's voice boomed. "The Sky Needle is surrounded. The dawn will not save you." Calixa looked up, her expression hardening. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, regal fury. She was done being the victim of the echo. "Surrender the hybrids," Morrow commanded. "Give us the abominations and you may return to the High Spire. You will be cleansed. You will be forgiven. This is the mercy of the Council." Mason looked at Calixa. He expected her to shout, to scream. Instead, she straightened her spine. She reached up and adjusted the tattered collar of her flight suit, as if it were a royal gown. She spoke calmly, but she projected her voice, letting the ravine carry it up. "I do not ask for mercy," Calixa said. Her voice was ice and steel. "And I certainly do not ask for forgiveness from a man who hunts children in the dark." "Dark, dark," the ravine repeated, but this time it sounded like an agreement. "You choose death, then." Morrow's voice came back, devoid of emotion. "So be it. The ravine will be your tomb." "Hey!" Mason shouted, stepping forward. He cupped his hands around his helmet's vocalizer. "Hey, Buckethead! Buckethead head." "I don't know what the return policy is on cleansing," Mason yelled, his sarcasm cutting through the tension. "But I generally don't sign custody papers for guys wearing masks. It is a personal rule." There was a pause. The wind howled. "The human," Morrow's voice returned dismissive. "You are an irrelevance. You will die with them." A sudden rumble shook the ground. Dust cascaded from the cliffs. Morrow was not just talking. His team was setting charges to trigger a rockfall. "Run!" Mason shouted. They scrambled forward, navigating the twisting maze of the canyon floor. Stones began to rain down, bouncing off the walls with terrified clatters. As they rounded a sharp bend, seeking shelter under a natural archway, a soft, pitiful sound stopped them. It was Saf, the female cub. Calixa dropped to her knees, pulling the sling open. The cub was limp. The beautiful blue bioluminescence that had bloomed after the meal was fading rapidly. Her skin was turning a dull, chalky gray. "She is crashing," Era said, sliding to a halt beside them. She pulled out her scanner. "Metabolic failure. The algae mixture burned through too fast. She needs pure energy, Mason. Now." "I don't have any," Mason said, patting his empty pockets. "We used it all." "She will not make the mile to the tower," Era said grimly. "Her heart is slowing." Calixa looked at Mason. She didn't beg this time. She just looked at him with a devastation that was absolute. Mason looked at the cub. He looked at the gray skin. He felt the phantom weight of the Nutrigel packets he had discarded. He had nothing left. Wait. He did have something. Mason reached for the seal on his suit's utility port. "What are you doing?" Era asked. "My suit," Mason said. "It has an emergency nutrient reservoir, intravenous glucose, and electrolytes. It is designed to keep me conscious if I get trapped in a wreck for a week." "If you drain that," Era warned, "and your suit loses power, you will have no reserves. The cold will take you in an hour." "It is a good thing I walk fast, then," Mason said. He unlatched the port and pulled out the small, clear tube of high-density fluid. It was his lifeline. It was the only thing standing between him and hypothermia-induced coma. He popped the seal. "Here," Mason said, kneeling. He carefully dripped the thick, clear liquid into the cub's mouth. It was sweet, concentrated energy. Saf choked, then swallowed. Once, twice. Mason poured the entire tube. He squeezed every drop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a spark. A vein of light ignited in the cub's neck. It spread down her chest brighter than before. She gasped, her tiny claws flexing, and the gray faded, replaced by the vibrant, living blue. Mason sat back, breathing hard. His suit chimed a low warning, nutrient reserves depleted. Metabolic support offline. He felt the cold instantly. It seeped through the layers of his suit, finding the sweat on his skin and turning it to ice. Calixa stared at him. She looked at the empty tube in his hand, then at his face. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of confusion and awe. She had seen him fight. She had seen him fix things. But she had never seen a human weaken himself to save an Ailuri. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because she was dying," Mason said, standing up. He swayed slightly, dizziness hitting him. "And I am tired of watching things die." Calixa stood slowly. She reached out and took his gloved hand. Her fingers were warm. "You have the strength of a mountain," she whispered. "Not of stone, but of fire beneath the stone." "I am just a mechanic, Calixa," Mason muttered, pulling his hand away gently. "Don't make it poetic." "The sky break," Era interrupted, checking her chronometer. "We have 20 minutes. The gap in the clouds will only last for 60 seconds. If we are not at the base of the needle when the light hits, the amplification won't work." 60 seconds? Mason stared at her. "You forgot to mention the window was that small." "I thought it might discourage you," Era admitted. "The sky needle is a prism. It catches the dawn light and refracts it into a localized shield dome. That shield will protect us from the scars and concentrate the radiation for the cubs. But we have to be inside the perimeter when it activates." They started moving again, faster this time. The threat of the scars was physical, but the threat of the timeline was absolute. As they walked, the ravine seemed to sense Mason's weakened state. The whispers grew louder. "Fool dead man, you gave it away." Mason ignored them. He focused on the rhythm of his boots. Thud-clack, thud-clack. Calixa moved closer to him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "The vow," she said, her voice low, so the ravine wouldn't catch it. "I said it in the cave. I meant it." Mason sighed, his breath pluming in the air. "Calixa, look. I am a guy who fixes garbage. You are, well, you are you, a princess, a warrior. We are not exactly a match on the dating apps." "I do not know what an app is," Calixa said. "But the vow is not about compatibility of hobbies. It is about the synchronization of survival. You gave your lifeblood for Saf just now. That is the bond." "I gave her sugar water," Mason corrected. "Let's not over-dramatize it. I am not ready to be a husband, or a mate, or whatever this is. I am barely managing to be a functional adult." "You are afraid," Calixa stated. "Yes, I am afraid," Mason snapped. The echo caught it. "Afraid, afraid. I am afraid because forever is a long time," Mason said, lowering his voice. "And every time I promise to stick around, something breaks." "I don't want to be the reason you break." Calixa stopped. She turned to him, forcing him to halt. The scars were close behind them. He could hear the scrape of metal on stone, but she didn't care. "It is not a contract, Mason," she said, her silver eyes locking onto his. "Contracts are for trading goods. This is a choice. I choose you. Not because you are useful, but because when the dark came, you became the light." Mason stared at her. The words hit him harder than the cold. Choice. He had spent 10 years letting life happen to him. He took the jobs that appeared. He went where the wind blew. He ran when it got hard. He had convinced himself he had no agency, that he was just debris in orbit. But she was offering him a choice. To stay. To matter. And that terrified him more than the Inquisitors. "We have to go," Mason said, his voice rough. He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no. And for the first time, he didn't pull away. They rounded the final bend of the Echo Ravine. The view opened up with shocking suddenness. The claustrophobic walls fell away, revealing the northern face of the mountain. And there it was, the Sky Needle. It was magnificent, a spire of translucent crystal, rising 300 feet into the air, sharp as a syringe. It hummed with a low resonance, vibrating in time with the magnetic storm. It looked fragile, beautiful, and impossibly far away. Between them and the tower lay 500 yards of open, exposed scree. And lining the ridges on either side, black silhouettes against the gray sky, were the Scar Inquisitors. They were waiting. Ambush, Mason said, stating the obvious. They knew we had to come here, Era said. It is the choke point. Morrow stepped out from behind a rock formation near the base of the tower. He was holding a long, wicked-looking blade that crackled with energy. The time for talking is done. Morrow's voice carried over the wind, no longer amplified, just cold and final. End them. Mason looked at his suit power. 6%. He looked at his multi-tool, half charge. He looked at Calixa, who was unsheathing her claws, her body tense, ready to die to protect the bundle on her chest. He looked at the cubs. They were awake, their eyes glowing, watching him. Mason took a deep breath. The cold air burned his lungs. Doctor, Mason said, get Calixa to the tower. When the light hits you, get that shield up. And you? Ira asked. Mason activated the plasma cutter on his tool. It hummed to life a small, defiant blue flame against the encroaching dark. I am going to void the warranty on my equipment, Mason said. He didn't think about running. He didn't think about the settlement south. He thought about the choice. Let's go, Mason said. They stepped out of the ravine and into the kill zone. The skybreak was minutes away. The race was on. The base of the Sky Needle was not merely a location. It was a fortress of geology. The spire did not just rise from the ground. It erupted, a violent splinter of translucent quartz that pierced the frozen crust of Virae, like a spear thrown by a god. At its foot, the terrain was a nightmare of jagged scree ice bridges and razor-sharp obsidian shards that had fallen from the cliffs above during centuries of magnetic storms. Mason Hart stood behind a slab of rock, his breath misting the inside of his visor. His suit diagnostics were screaming at him. 5% power, core temperature dropping, structural integrity compromised. He ignored them all. His attention was focused entirely on the black shapes moving across the white snowfield between him and the tower's entrance. The Scar Inquisitors had stopped sliding. They had formed a perimeter, a perfect semicircle of matte black armor and humming plasma rifles. They stood with the stillness of statues, unbothered by the wind that was currently threatening to tear Mason's pack off his shoulders. In the center of the formation stood Arch-Justicar Drake Morrow. He had removed his helmet. It was an act of supreme arrogance in this temperature, but it served a purpose. He wanted them to see his face. He wanted them to see that he was not a monster, but a man of conviction. His skin was pale, scarred by frostburn and battle, and his eyes were the color of steel wool. There is nowhere left to run, Princess, Morrow called out. His voice was not amplified by technology this time, but the acoustics of the valley carried it with terrifying clarity. The tower is sealed, the sky is dark. You have led these abominations to their grave. Calixa crouched beside Mason, her claws digging into the rock. She was shivering, not just from cold, but from a lethal exhaustion. The light weave illusion she had cast in the ravine had taken the last of her reserves. The cubs in the sling against her chest were silent, their bioluminescence dimmed to a faint, pulsing gray. He talks too much, Mason muttered, checking the charge on his multi-tool. Do all your villains give speeches? It is very inefficient. He believes he is saving the soul of our species, Calixa whispered, her silver eyes fixed on Morrow. He needs us to understand why we must die. It makes him feel righteous. Righteousness is heavy armor, Mason said, engaging the locking mechanism on his tool. It makes you slow. Doctor, Mason whispered over his shoulder to Era Vale. How long until skybreak? Dr. Era Vale was huddled behind them, clutching her datapad like a shield. She looked terrified, but her voice was steady. 4 minutes, maybe 5. The atmospheric density is fluctuating. If we miss the window, the tower will not amplify anything. It will just be a very tall, very cold tombstone. 4 minutes, Mason repeated. He looked at the blockade. 6 elite hunters, 1 fanatic leader, and 500 yards of open ground. "We need a door," Mason said. "I am going to make one." He looked up. Above the scar formation, hanging precariously from the side of the cliff face, was a massive shelf of blue ice. It was tons of frozen water suspended by nothing more than the friction of the rock and the magnetic tension of the storm. "Pip," Mason hissed. The drone floated up from behind the rock, its single eye spinning. "My sensors indicate a 100% probability of death if you engage them frontally. I suggest we surrender and hope they need a mechanic for their prison systems." "Scan that ice shelf," Mason ordered, ignoring the drone's pessimism. "Find the stress fracture," Pip whirred. "Scanning. Structure is unstable. A thermal shock of sufficient magnitude at coordinates 3 alpha 7 would cause catastrophic structural failure." "Catastrophic failure," Mason grinned, though his lips were numb. "My favorite kind." He adjusted his multi-tool. He didn't have a weapon capable of reaching the shelf, but he had the environment. He pulled a flare cartridge from his belt, standard salvage gear for signaling ships. He jammed it into the modification slot of the tool, bypassing the safety regulators. "This is going to ruin the barrel," Mason noted. "Do it," Calixa said. Mason stood up. The movement drew the eyes of every Inquisitor instantly, weapons raised. "Hey, Morrow!" Mason shouted, stepping out from cover. "You forgot to look up." He fired. The flare did not travel in a straight line. The wind caught it, curving its arc. For a second, it looked like he had missed by a mile. The scars didn't even flinch. Morrow actually smirked, a thin, cruel twisting of his lips. Then the flare hit the stress fracture. It wasn't a large explosion. It was just a spark, a sudden bloom of heat in a structure that had been frozen for 1,000 years. The ice groaned. A sound like a breaking bone echoed through the valley. Then, gravity took over. The shelf sheared off. Tons of ice crashed down, not directly onto the scars, but into the slope above them. The impact triggered a slide. A wall of white powder and jagged rocks roared down the mountainside, sweeping directly across the scar formation. "Break!" Morrow screamed, his composure shattering. The Inquisitors scattered their magnetic boots, firing to propel them out of the path of the avalanche. The perfect semicircle was broken. Chaos erupted. "Run!" Mason roared. He grabbed Ira by the back of her coat and shoved her forward. Calixa was already moving, sprinting with a desperate grace, her body angled to shield the cubs from the flying debris. They charged into the whiteout. The snow cloud from the avalanche reduced visibility to 0. It was a blind dash through a freezing fog. "Pip, guide us!" Mason yelled. "Left, hard left!" Pip's voice cut through the roar of the slide. "Avoid the boulder gap in the formation at 2 o'clock." They ran. Mason's lungs burned as if he were inhaling glass. His legs felt like lead weights. But he kept moving, his eyes scanning the swirling white for the black armor of the enemy. A shadow loomed out of the fog. An Inquisitor separated from his unit stumbled directly into their path. He raised his rifle, the muzzle glowing blue. Calixa didn't stop. She didn't have the energy for a light weave, but she had the tower. "Reflect!" she gasped. She reached out a hand toward the base of the Sky Needle, which was now looming directly above them. The crystal surface of the tower caught the faint ambient light of the storm. Calixa twisted her hand. The crystal responded. A beam of concentrated light, dim but focused, shot from the tower's surface, bouncing off the ice at her feet and slamming directly into the Inquisitor's visor. It wasn't a laser. It was a mirror flash, a sudden overload of visual data. The Inquisitor reeled back, blinded, his shot going wild. "Nice trick," Mason yelled, shouldering past the stunned hunter. "It drains me," Calixa panted. She stumbled, nearly dropping the cubs. Mason caught her arm, hauling her up. "Keep moving. We are almost at the door." They reached the base of the tower. The entrance was a massive archway of natural crystal, smooth and cold. But standing in front of it, emerging from the dissipating snow cloud, was Morrow. He had lost his cloak. His armor was dented, but he was standing firm, his sword a vibrating blade of monofilament wire held low. Persistent, Morrow spat. But futile. Behind him, the other scars were regrouping, closing the net. "Doctor," Mason said, his voice low. "Take the cubs, get inside." "I can't," Era stammered. "He will kill you." "He is going to try," Mason said. "Go." Calixa hesitated. She looked at Mason, then at the cubs. "Go." Mason shoved them toward the side of the archway. As Era scrambled forward, one of the cubs, Kit, slipped from the sling. The sudden movement had loosened the fabric. The small creature tumbled onto the snow, mewling in distress. "No!" Calixa screamed. She lunged for the cub, but she was too far. Era turned back. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a hero. She was a biologist who liked algae. But she threw herself over the cub just as a plasma bolt struck the ground where it had been. Morrow moved. He didn't strike. He grabbed. His hand, encased in a powered gauntlet, closed around Era's neck. He lifted her off the ground, her feet kicking uselessly. He held her like a shield, the blade of his sword hovering inches from her chest. "Stop!" Morrow commanded. Mason froze. Calixa froze halfway to the door. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. "You have a choice, mechanic," Morrow said, his voice smooth. "You can continue your foolish run. You might even make it inside. But the biologist dies, and then I will hunt you down in the dark of the tower." Morrow tightened his grip. Era gasped, her face turning red. The cub Kit was shivering at her feet, exposed and terrified. "Or," Morrow continued, "you lay down your tools. You surrender the hybrids, and I will let the human woman live. I will let you walk away. This is not your war, Mason Hart." Mason stood there, his chest heaving. The wind howled around the spire. He looked at Era. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears, behind her cracked spectacles. She shook her head slightly. "Don't." He looked at Calixa. She was crouched by the door, the other two cubs clutched to her. She didn't speak. She didn't beg. She just watched him. "Choose," she had said. "Don't run." The echo of the ravine played in his mind. "Coward. You let them die. You fix the machine, not the people." If he surrendered, the cubs died. If he fought, Era died. It was the Icarus all over again. The logic of the greater good versus the immediate life. "I am waiting," Morrow said. "The sun is rising, mechanic. Make your calculation." Mason looked at his hands. They were shaking. Not from cold, from rage. "Pip," Mason whispered. "I am jamming their localized comms," Pip whispered back. "But I cannot jam a sword." Mason looked past Morrow. To the right, on a ridge overlooking the entrance, stood a sniper. It was Rook, the Inquisitor who had hesitated before. Rook had a clear shot at Calixa. His rifle was raised, but he wasn't firing. Through the scope, Rook was looking at the cub on the ground. Kit looked back, his large ears twitching, his fur beginning to glow with a soft, defiant blue light as the first hint of dawn touched the atmosphere. Rook lowered his rifle. Just an inch. Mason saw it. It was a fracture in the enemy's resolve. "Hey, Morrow," Mason said, his voice loud. "You are right. It is a calculation." He reached for his backpack. "Mason, no," Calixa whispered. Mason unbuckled the pack. It contained the last of the supplies, the heating unit, the jar of algae, the tools. It was their survival kit. "I am a mechanic," Mason said, swinging the pack off his shoulder. "I deal in trade-offs." He looked at Calixa. "Catch." He didn't throw it at Morrow. He threw the heavy pack with all his strength high into the air, toward Calixa and the tower entrance. Morrow's eyes flicked upward, instinctively. It was a reflex. In that split second of distraction, Mason didn't run away. He didn't surrender. He activated the winch on his salvage suit. The cable usually used for hauling engine parts shot out from his left wrist. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tow line. A magnetic grapple hook tipped the end. Mason aimed not at Morrow, but at Era's belt. Clang. The hook latched onto the biologist's heavy thermal harness. "Retract!" Mason screamed. The winch motor shrieked. It yanked Era backward with the force of a car crash. She flew out of Morrow's grip just as the Arch-Justicar's sword slashed the air where her neck had been a millisecond before. Morrow roared in fury, turning on Mason. "Go!" Mason yelled at Era, who was now skidding across the ice toward him. He grabbed her, hauled her up, and scooped up the cub kid in one motion. "To the tower now." He pushed Era toward the entrance, where Calixa had caught the backpack. "Kill them!" Morrow screamed. "Kill them all." The scars opened fire. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air. Mason felt a searing heat graze his shoulder. His suit alarm shrieked armor breach. Cauterization complete. "Shields!" Mason yelled at Calixa. "Do the thing." Calixa stood in the doorway of the tower. She looked at the sky, and then it happened. Skybreak. It started as a fissure in the gray ceiling of the world. A line of gold so bright it hurt to look at sliced through the storm clouds. The sun of Verai, hidden for 3 years, blinked open an eye. A beam of pure, unfiltered starlight hammered down. It hit the tip of the sky needle 300 feet above them. The tower woke up. A hum, deep and resonant, vibrated through the ground. It shook the snow off the rocks. It shook the teeth in Mason's skull. The light traveled down the crystal spire, intensifying, refracting. When it hit the base, it didn't stop. It exploded outward. Calixa threw her arms wide. She didn't weave the light this time. She channeled it. A wall of prismatic energy slammed down around the entrance of the tower just as the volley of plasma fire reached them. The bolts hit the barrier and dissolved into harmless sparks. Morrow shielded his eyes, staggering back from the brilliance. "Inside, move, move, move!" Mason ushered Era and the cub through the archway. They tumbled into the interior of the tower. It was a vast, hollow shaft lined with spiraling stairs that wound up along the inner walls. The center was open, a vertical tunnel of light. "We have to go up," Era gasped, pointing to the stairs. "The amplification is strongest at the apex. The shield at the base won't hold forever. Morrow will breach it." "Up!" Mason groaned, looking at the endless spiral. "Why is it always stairs? Why couldn't the ancients invent an elevator?" "Cardio is good for the heart," Calixa said, breathless but smiling. Her fur was glowing now, soaking in the ambient energy of the tower. "My heart is currently trying to escape my chest," Mason grumbled. They began to climb. Outside, the banging began. Morrow and his squad were hammering at the energy shield. The whole tower vibrated with each impact. Boom, boom, boom. It sounded like a drum. "They are using seismic charges," Pip reported, floating beside Mason's head. "The barrier integrity is dropping. 70%. 60. "Keep climbing," Mason ordered. He carried Kit in one arm. The cub was heavy, but he felt warm. The little creature was purring a sound that resonated with the hum of the tower. Step after step, flight after flight. Mason's legs burned. His chest heaved. He was running on fumes, adrenaline, and pure stubbornness. "You are doing well, human," Calixa called down from above. She was faster, her Eluri physiology suited for agility. She carried the other 2 cubs, bounding up the steps 2 at a time. "Don't patronize me, princess," Mason wheezed. "I am pacing myself." "The shield is at 30%, Pip warned. Below them, the entrance exploded. The barrier shattered. Debris flew up the shaft. "They are in!" Era screamed. Morrow led the charge. He looked small from this height, a black insect crawling up the spiral. But he was fast. He used his magnetic gliders to adhere to the smooth crystal ramp of the stairs, sliding up rather than running. "He is cheating," Mason yelled. "That is definitely cheating." "Faster," Calixa urged. They were nearing the top. The light in the shaft was becoming blinding. The air was charged with static electricity. Mason's hair was standing on end inside his helmet. "Almost there," Mason gasped. "Just 20 more floors." "5," Era corrected. "5 floors." Morrow leveled his rifle while sliding. He fired upward. The shot hit the stairs near Mason's feet, blowing a chunk of crystal away. Mason stumbled, nearly falling over the edge into the central shaft. He caught the railing, which was also made of crystal, just in time. "Pip, distract him." "I am a repair drone," Pip protested. "I am not combat rated." "You are a flying brick," Mason yelled. "Use your head literally." Pip sighed a static sound and dive-bombed. The drone plummeted down the shaft, accelerating. It slammed into Morrow's helmet with a metallic clang. Morrow faltered, swiping at the drone. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it slowed his ascent. "Good bot," Mason muttered, scrambling up the last few steps. They burst onto the observation deck. It was a circular platform open to the sky. The walls were jagged spikes of crystal that acted as lenses. The beam of sunlight from the skybreak was hitting a central prism, a massive diamond-shaped structure in the middle of the floor. The light was intense. It was gold-white and blue all at once. Calixa ran to the prism. She placed the 2 cubs she carried onto the warm surface of the crystal. Mason gently set Kit down beside them. "Is this it?" Mason asked, collapsing against a pillar. "Did we win?" "Not yet," Calixa said. She looked at the skybreak above. The gap in the clouds was already beginning to close. The wind was howling, trying to stitch the sky back together. "The light is fading," Era said, checking her scanner. "The storm is fighting back. We need more power to stabilize the cubs." Morrow burst onto the platform. He was alone. His squad was still climbing below. He looked ragged, his armor scorched his face, a mask of hate. "It ends," Morrow rasped, raising his sword. "No more running!" The sky needle began to sing. It was a high, piercing note, triggered by the weapon fire and the magnetic pressure. The crystal floor vibrated. Morrow charged. Mason stood up. He had no weapon. His multi-tool was dead. His suit was dead. He had a grapple hook and a bad attitude. "Stay back, Calixa," Mason said, stepping between the princess and the hunter. "No," Calixa said. She stepped up beside him. Her eyes were not silver anymore. They were burning with the reflection of the sun. "He wants a fight," Calixa said. "Let us give him a war." Morrow lunged. Mason sidestepped, not trying to block, but trying to trip. He caught Morrow's arm using the grapple line he still had attached to Era's harness, which he had quickly unhooked from her and wrapped around his fist. He looped the wire around Morrow's sword arm. Morrow twisted the servo motors in his armor, whining. He backhanded Mason, sending him flying across the platform. Mason hit the crystal wall hard. He tasted blood. Morrow turned to Calixa. "You are weak, princess. You rely on mongrels and mechanics." He raised the sword to strike. Calixa didn't dodge. She reached out and grabbed the blade, not with her hand, with the light. She caught the energy of the sword in a weave of hard light, holding it inches from her face. Her skin sizzled. She screamed in pain, but she held it. "I rely," Calixa grit out, "on the fact that you are obsolete." She twisted the light. The sword shattered. Morrow stared at the broken hilt in his hand. Mason scrambled up, wiping blood from his mouth. He looked at Calixa. She was glowing, but she was fading fast. The effort had cost her everything. "The vow," Calixa whispered, looking at Mason. "It is time." The skybreak above sealed shut. The sun vanished. The platform plunged into twilight. The cubs on the prism let out a collective wail as the light source died. Their glow began to sputter. Morrow laughed. It was a dark, wet sound. "You see," Morrow said, "the universe rejects you. The dark always wins." Calixa looked at Mason. Her expression was terrifyingly calm. "Mason," she said, "come here." What? Mason stumbled toward her. We need a plan. We need no plan, Calixa said. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the central prism where the cubs lay dying. It is time to pay the price for the vow, she said. Mason felt a chill go down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. What price? He asked. Your heart, Calixa said, and then she placed his hand onto the crystal surface of the prism. The light died. That was the first thing Mason Hart noticed. It was not the return of the wind, though the gale slammed against the crystal walls of the Sky Needle with the force of a physical blow. It was not the drop in temperature, though the readout on his cracked visor plummeted so fast the numbers blurred. It was the light. The skybreak, that miraculous golden fissure in the storm clouds that they had raced 10 miles to catch, blinked shut. The sun of Vere, having stared down at them for less than 60 seconds, turned its back. The gray, suffocating ceiling of the black winter sealed itself again, leaving the observation deck plunged into a twilight gloom. The central prism, which only moments ago had been singing with absorbed, stellar radiation, went dormant. It was just a cold rock now. On the surface of that rock, the three cubs, Kit, Saf, and Bram, let out a collective synchronized wail. It was a sound of absolute despair. The soft blue bioluminescence that had begun to bloom under their skin flickered and vanished, leaving them looking small, gray, and terrifyingly still. No, Calixa whispered. Her voice was not a scream. It was a hollow exhale, the sound of a statue cracking. She fell to her knees beside the prism, her hands hovering over the cubs, trying to weave a light that was no longer there. Do not fade. Please, do not fade. Arch-Justicar Drake Morrow laughed. He stood near the edge of the platform, the shattered hilt of his sword still in his hand. He looked less like a soldier now, and more like a prophet of doom. You see, Princess Mor. Morrow said, his voice carrying over the rising wind. The universe has spoken. Nature rejects the impurity. You ran, you fought, you bled, and for what? To watch them die in the dark. Morrow took a step forward. He tossed the broken sword handle aside and drew a backup weapon from his hip, a heavy kinetic pistol. He did not aim at Calixa. He aimed at the cubs. They are suffering, Morrow said. His tone devoid of cruelty, filled only with a terrible cold logic. I will end it. It is the only mercy left. Mason Hart was on the ground where Morrow had backhanded him. His mouth tasted of copper. His ribs felt like a bag of gravel. Every instinct he had cultivated over 10 years of salvage work screamed one instruction. Stay down. The mission has failed. The package is lost. Survival protocol dictates you play dead and wait for the predator to leave. Mason looked at the gun. He looked at the gray, motionless shapes on the prism. He looked at Calixa's back, which was shaking with silent sobs. And then he looked at his own hands. They were dirty, scarred, and trembling, but they were still working. Pip, Mason croaked. The drone was buzzing erratically near the ceiling, sparking from the impact with Morrow's helmet. Systems critical, Pip stuttered. Optical sensors damaged. I advise playing dead. Override, Mason grunted. Broadcast. Broadcast what? Pip asked. The atmospheric interferences. Broadcast the distress signal. Mason roared, forcing himself up. Maximum gain. Blow your circuits if you have to. Just get a signal out. Up, Churchy. Acknowledged, Pip chirped, sounding uncharacteristically solemn. Initiating final transmission. Mason stepped between Morrow and the prism. He had no weapon. He had no armor integrity. He stood with his feet planted wide, swaying slightly, a human shield made of flesh and stubbornness. Morrow paused the pistol, wavering slightly. Move, mechanic. You are not part of this equation. I am the variable you forgot, Mason spat, wiping blood from his chin. You want to shoot them? You go through me. Why? Morrow asked, genuinely confused. They are dead already. Look at them. The light is gone. They are batteries without a charge. I don't care, Mason said. And for the first time in a decade, he meant it. He wasn't thinking about the Icarus. He wasn't thinking about the woman he had locked behind the blast door. He was thinking that if he moved, he would be the man who let the darkness win twice. I am not moving, Morrow's face hardened. Then you die with the error. He leveled the pistol at Mason's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. Bang! The shot rang out sharp and deafening in the enclosed space. Mason flinched, waiting for the impact, waiting for the burn. It didn't come. Instead, sparks erupted from the floor, inches from Morrow's right boot. The arched Justicar jumped back, startled, looking toward the spiral staircase. Standing at the top of the stairs, rifle raised, was Rook. The Scar Inquisitor had removed his helmet. His face was young, terrified and streaked with sweat. He was shaking, but the rifle was pointed steadily at his commander. "Stand down, sir," Rook said, his voice cracking. Morrow stared at him, his eyes wide with shock. "Rook, you dare raise a weapon against a Justicar?" "I am not shooting you, sir," Rook stammered. "I am interrupting your field of fire." "This is treason," Morrow hissed. "This is heresy. You will be stripped of your rank. You will be erased." "I know," Rook said. He swallowed hard. "But I saw the cub glow, down at the gate. It looked like a life, sir, not a disease." "It is a trick," Morrow screamed, losing his composure. "It is a biological mimicry." "It is a baby," Rook said softly, "and I am done killing babies." The distraction was brief, but it was enough. Calixa turned to Mason. Her face was a mask of desperation. She grabbed his wrist with a grip that felt like iron. "Mason," she said, "the vow." "We established that," Mason yelled, keeping his eyes on Morrow. "I am here. I am standing in front of the gun. Is that not enough commitment for you?" "No," Calixa said. She pulled him down. "Not a shield. A source." "What?" "The milk," Calixa gasped. "You still do not understand. The milk they cried for in the cave, it was never the gel. The gel is dead matter. Ailuri are starborn. We feed on frequency, on resonance. The cubs need a rhythm to latch onto. A heartbeat that is strong enough to pace their own." She slammed Mason's hand onto the surface of the central prism, right next to the motionless bodies of the cubs. "The tower," Calixa explained rapidly, her words tumbling over each other. "It is an amplifier. It takes starlight and turns it into life force, but the sun is gone. We need another source. A biological source." Mason stared at her. "You want me?" "I want your heart," Calixa said. "Literally. The mate vow is not poetry, Mason. It is biology. It creates a sympathetic resonance. It syncs our pulse. If you accept the bond, the tower will take the rhythm of your heart, amplify it 1,000 times, and feed it to them as artificial light." Mason looked at the prism. He looked at the cubs. "And if it doesn't work," Mason asked. "Then the amplifier will drain you until your heart stops," Dr. Era Vale said. She had crawled up the stairs behind Rook, dragging her datapad. She looked at the readings. "She is right, Mason. It is theoretically possible. A biofeedback loop. But the strain could kill you." "Great," Mason said. "Just great." Morrow, recovering from his shock, raised his pistol again. "Enough of this sorcery." Rook fired a warning shot, hitting the pillar next to Morrow's head. "I said stand down." "You cannot stop me, boy." Morrow roared, charging forward, ignoring the fire. "Do it, Mason!" Calixa screamed. "Choose." Mason looked at her. He saw the woman who had fought an army for her children. He saw the creature who had looked at a packet of vanilla paste and offered him eternity. "Okay," Mason said. "Okay, I choose. But if I die, I am going to be very annoyed." He pressed his palm flat against the cold crystal. He closed his eyes, and he stopped running. "I am here," he thought. I am not leaving. Accept the bond, Calixa whispered, placing her hand over his. Her skin was burning hot. Sink with me. At first there was nothing, just the cold stone and the sound of Morrow shouting. Then Mason felt it. It started as a thrum in his wrist. A vibration that traveled up his arm, bypassing his nerves, and hitting him straight in the chest. It wasn't pain. It was a tug, a demand. Thump, thump. His heart beat. The tower answered. Boom, boom. The sound resonated through the entire spire. It wasn't the high-pitched singing of the crystal anymore. It was a deep bass drum beat. Mason gasped. He felt like a hook had been set in his chest. His vision narrowed. Thump, thump. Boom, boom. The central prism began to glow. But it wasn't the white gold of the sun. It was a deep, pulsing crimson. The color of blood. The color of a human heart. What is this? Morrow froze, staring at the crystal. What have you done? I gave them a father, Calixa whispered. The red light spread. It flowed from the prism, washing over the cubs. It didn't just illuminate them, it entered them. Mason felt a sudden massive drain, as if someone had opened a valve in his veins. His knees buckled. Mason, Calixa held him up. Stay with me, breathe. I am trying, Mason wheezed. Your kids are very hungry. And then the miracle happened. Kit, the small gray cub, twitched. His ears swiveled. He opened his mouth and took a deep breath, inhaling the red light. His fur ignited. It wasn't the soft blue anymore. It was a vibrant, shifting violet, pulsing in perfect time with the booming sound of the tower. Boom, boom, flash, flash. Saf followed. Then Bram. One by one they woke up. They rolled over, stretching their limbs, their eyes snapping open. They looked at Mason. They didn't see a mechanic. They saw the source. They saw the beat. They began to cry. It wasn't the wail of dying things. It was the loud, demanding, annoying cry of hungry babies who wanted attention immediately. Moo, moo, moo. The sound filled the observation deck, drowning out the wind. Mason slumped against the prism, laughing weakly. Tears were streaming down his face, though he didn't know when he had started crying. Well, Mason rasped, looking at the glowing, noisy bundle of life. Would you look at that? They turned the lights on. Morrow stared in horror. He took a step back, shaking his head. Impossible. A human and an Aeluri sinking. It violates every law of nature. Nature adapts, Drake, Dr. Aravale said, standing up and adjusting her cracked glasses. That is what it does. It finds a way to survive. Unlike you. Morrow snarled. It changes nothing. I will shatter the crystal. I will. He raised his gun for a final, desperate execution. Whirr! Click. The sound came from above. Through the darkened skylight, lights appeared. Not starlight. Searchlights. Massive, blinding beams that cut through the storm clouds. A voice, amplified by military-grade speakers, boomed down from the sky. This is the Federation Search and Rescue Vessel Horizon. We have received a Priority 1 distress signal. Identify yourselves. Pip, floating wobbly near the ceiling, let out a triumphant beep. Signal lock confirmed. The amplifier boosted my transmission range by 4,000%. I told you I was efficient. Morrow looked up at the heavy dropships descending through the clouds. He looked at Rook, who was still pointing the rifle at him. He looked at the cubs, glowing and alive. He dropped the gun. It clattered on the crystal floor. It is over, sir, Rook said quietly. Morrow looked at Calixa. The hate in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow confusion. You diluted the bloodline. You broke the tradition. Calixa stood up. She was weak, leaning on the prism, but she held her head high. She reached down and picked up Kit, holding the glowing cub against her chest. I did not break it, Calixa said. I evolved it. The dropships landed on the lower platforms, their engines roaring. Heavily armed Marines poured out, securing the stairs. Morrow did not fight. He sank to his knees, defeated not by force, but by a reality he could not comprehend. He had hunted a monster and found a family, and that truth broke him more than any weapon could. An hour later, the observation deck was quiet. The Federation medics had stabilized the cubs. They were currently sleeping in a heated containment unit, their bellies full of actual synthetic nutrient formula that Era had synthesized from the rescue ship's supplies. Morrow and the remaining Scar Inquisitors had been taken into custody. Rook had surrendered voluntarily, sitting quietly with his hands on his head, looking strangely at peace. Mason sat on the edge of the platform, his legs dangling over the spiral abyss. A medic was applying a dermal patch to the burn on his shoulder. "You are lucky, pal," the medic said, packing up his kit. "Another inch to the left and that plasma bolt would have cooked your lung. And your heart, your cardiac rhythm is all over the place. It looks like you ran a marathon while having a panic attack." "Sounds about right," Mason muttered. The medic left. Mason was alone, staring at the gray sky. The storm was finally breaking for real, this time, the magnetic winds dying down. He heard footsteps behind him. Soft, rhythmic steps. He didn't turn around. "Hey, Princess!" Calixa sat down beside him. She had been given a thermal blanket which she wore like a royal cloak. She looked tired, her silver skin pale, but her eyes were clear. "Dr. Vale says they will be fine," Calixa said. "The Federation has offered a sanctuary on the orbital station. They are interested in the cubs, scientifically." "Of course they are," Mason said. "Glowing cat babies who run on human heartbeats. You are going to be on the cover of every science journal in the sector." "They say I can petition for asylum," Calixa continued. "The High Spire will not touch us while the Federation is watching." "Good," Mason said. "That is good." Silence stretched between them. It wasn't the awkward silence of the cave. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of two people who had seen the end of the world and lived. "And you?" Calixa asked. "Where will you go, Mason Hart? The Horizon leaves in 2 hours. They said they can drop you at the nearest trade port." Mason looked at his hands. The shaking had stopped. He thought about his ship. It was a rust bucket. He thought about his apartment on the colony world. It was empty. He thought about the silence he had lived in for 10 years. "I don't know," Mason said. "I usually just go to the next job." Calixa reached out and took his hand. She turned it over, tracing the lines on his palm with her cool finger. "The vow," she said softly. "The biosync. It fades, you know. Now that the tower is off, the resonance will decouple. You are not bound to me physically anymore. My heart beats on its own again." Mason looked at her. "So, the contract is expired." "The emergency clause is expired," Calixa corrected. She looked him in the eye. "But the offer remains." "Not because I need a battery, but because they need a father. And I—" She hesitated, looking away, a rare moment of shyness. "I find that I have grown fond of your chaotic tactics." Mason chuckled. "I threw a backpack at a warlord. That is not a tactic. That is desperation." "It worked," Calixa said. She squeezed his hand. "I do not need a King Mason. I had a crown and it was heavy. I do not need a hero. Heroes die." "What do you need?" Mason asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I need someone who stays," Calixa said. "Even when the skybreak ends? Even when the dark comes back?" Mason looked at the cubs sleeping in the medical pod nearby. He looked at Pip, who was currently arguing with a Federation drone about repair protocols. He looked at Era, who was happily lecturing a Marine about algae. He felt the fear again. The old fear. The fear of caring. But then he remembered the heat of the prism. He remembered the sound of the heartbeat. Boom, boom. It had been the loudest thing he had ever heard. He realized he didn't want the silence back. I am not good at forever Calixa, Mason said honestly. I am damaged goods. I have nightmares. I drink too much coffee, and I am terrible at following orders. Calixa smiled. It was the first real, relaxed smile he had seen on her face. It transformed her. I do not ask for forever today, she said. Forever is too big. Just give me for now. Mason looked at the horizon. The first real stars were beginning to poke through the thinning clouds. For now, Mason repeated. He squeezed her hand back. I can do for now. He stood up, pulling her with him. Come on, Mason said. Let's go see if the Federation has anything better to eat than vanilla paste. If I see another tube of that stuff, I am going to mutiny. Calixa laughed, the sound echoing pure and bright in the cold air. I think, she said, leaning her head on his shoulder as they walked toward the ship, that I would like to try this pizza you mentioned. Oh, you are pushing your luck, Princess, Mason grinned. But we will see. They walked toward the light of the ship, leaving the Sky Needle silent and dark behind them. The tower didn't need to sing anymore. The music was leaving with them,